Just by sheer coincidence this morning, I'm doing a feature from the Provincial Archives on International Archives Week. Is that important?
I'm an enormous supporter of archives. I use them all the time. I couldn't have written a single book of history without them. The BC Archives here are in the most marvelous building in Victoria. New building? It's a new building. I used it in the old building, but the archives are in a new building quite properly. They didn't tear down the old building, however, to put them in the new one. Willard Island, the late archivist there, was of so great a help to me when I wrote the National Museum, The Last Spike. I can't thank the archives enough. Good, and I can't thank you enough for adding your modest compromise solutions to the problems which exist with heritage inside and outside in the city of Vancouver. Thank you, Jack. My thanks to the Pierre Berton, Chairman of the Board of Governors of Heritage Canada, who wants another day off the third Monday in Feb. You bet. After the break. A spokesman for the Art Gallery in Vancouver will be on the program early this week. We haven't quite tied down a date. It's International Archives Week around the world, and in Victoria at the Provincial Archives building, a special display is in place tracing some of the important events in history over the last 200 years of BC's past. Brian Coxford went over and found out, as he visited the archives, that the role of the archival collection is rapidly changing, and I think you'll enjoy this feature from Victoria.
You might say the people in this building in the Provincial Archives have the power of life and death over events in BC history, because it's in this building where books and documents, originals, are kept. There's no other documents like them. If they disappear, events in BC history disappear.
We're saving various things for I think two different reasons. One, any archive has records that really have to be kept for the proper functioning of any society. You think of land titles, you think of wills. In our judicial system, how important precedent is, that legal documents, court records need to be preserved. Then you have the records that don't necessarily have to be preserved for the functioning of the world, but that people badly want to have preserved. Paintings in our collection, of maps in our collection, there's a sort of, not absolutely essential like bread and water, but a general desire for accessibility to sort of to the past. And perhaps that's because the world is changing so very fast. The faster the world changes, the greater the demands on archives, the greater the curiosity and the desire of the general public for the sort of materials we preserve.
Terry, it was what, somewhere in the vicinity of 1894 when you first started collecting?
Yes, the establishment of the Legislative Library with its first librarian, Gosnell, also established a sort of Northwest history collection activity, which formed the basis of the collection which is displayed in this display which we see here today. An archives is a place that preserves documentation both from government and from private sources to document the history of British Columbia and its environs.
And its environment, eh?
So once the archivist has collected whatever it is, it may be photographs, it may be manuscripts or large bodies of government records, he must organize them. He pays special attention to putting them in acid-free containers. He makes sure that to preserve them. He wants to extend the life as long as he can. And then his final task is to open them up to the public by making catalogs and indexes and various finding aids, as we call them, so that people can find out what treasures we have here for them to see.
I see the heading on this one is, why is Victoria the capital of British Columbia? And I guess anybody who's been in here long enough would would certainly know the arguments that went on about New Westminster and Victoria and all the political hassles of the time.
That's right. It goes back to our colonial history when this area of North America was a colony of British Columbia, of Great Britain. And in 66, the two colonies, 1866, the two colonies of Vancouver Island and British Columbia were joined. There had, of course, been a capital of each colony. They selected New Westminster as the capital of the combined colony, called British Columbia, of course.
But of course we know that's not the case today.
No, well, the preponderance of political influence remained in Victoria. There were...
That would have been where James Douglas...
that's where James Douglas had pretty well managed his affair and called home. It had, of course, back from the days of Fort Victoria, it had a larger population, and that population exerted its influence to draw the capital from New Westminster to Victoria.
Who do we owe the decision-making of the day for making Victoria the capital?
The decision rested with the governor of British Columbia at the time, Frederick Seymour. There is a picture there
Frederick
of him,
and his cat.
Yeah, sitting there on the porch of his house with his cat, and there's the colonial legislative buildings, the bird cages, which some people will know burnt down some 25 years ago. That's
as it existed in Frederick's day. Eh?
That's right, in Frederick's day. Yeah. Well, this brings us to another aspect of British Columbia's history, which is documented in the archives: tourism in the Rockies. And I see we have just the person to help us learn what's displayed here, Jack Webster's daughter, Linda Webster, who's working on this display right now.
Linda?
Oh, this is a panel on tourism in the Rockies. It began with the Canadian Pacific Railway in the 1880s. And this panel has been built around a painting by Frederick Marlett Bell Smith.
So the province, in terms of its early history, was quick to capitalize on tourism as a business then, eh?
Very much.
Or was it the CPR?
It was, I would say it was the CPR rather than the government of the province. Though, of course, the Government Travel Bureau has been active for many, many years.
How soon did CPR actively get involved? Like, were the very beginnings of tourism in BC?
Oh, I would say that the Glacier Hotel was one of the earlier
That goes back, what, to
tourist
about
spots.
the manuscript there?
I have the visitor's book for January 18th, 1887 here, which mentions...
2 years after the railway, eh?
Right, which mentions Bell Smith,
The painter.
the painter.
Mm-hmm. These are old
here
tourism brochures, I guess.
These are summer tours offered by the CPR in 1890 through 96. I happen to have the brochure for 1894 on display. And then later on, there was a fashion for bungalow camps in the Rockies. This was, a lot of this happened in the 1920s. And this particular little pamphlet was published in the early 1920s.
And
into the modern era almost, eh?
that's right. Here we have a figure in British Columbia's labor history, Ginger Goodwin, who is now known mostly for his death, you might say. He was in the Kootenays area early in his career, but the last part of his career was spent in Vancouver Island, where he was, you might say, a wanted man.
And what was his eventual fate?
And he was shot on July 27th, 1918 by a special constable, Daniel Campbell. You'll
He
see
became a
here-
hero, of course. by his death.
Certainly, I suppose, the one outstanding example of an authentic labor hero. There have been songs about him, poems about him. You have here a picture of his grave as it was years ago, and a picture of the funeral procession that was given
In Cumberland.
Goodwin, in Cumberland.
Yeah.
And
Indian cut-off lands, very much an issue in recent years, but certainly not a new thing.
that's right, and this display, which I had quite a bit to do with, really attempts to show some of the documentation for the understanding of this ongoing question. Probably it would be fair to say that the whole question of what lands Indians would occupy began the first time a white man, or a European if you wish, stepped ashore on Vancouver Island. From then on,
But
from
to
then-
many white men, it was an issue that started 5 years ago, eh?
That's right, but and we have here most of the documentation here is focusing on the particular commission in the period 1913 to 16, Joint Dominion Provincial Commission, which attempted to come to yet another decision as to what Indian lands would be established for their own use. And during that commission, certain reserve lands were reduced in size, hence the term cut-off lands. It is interesting, perhaps just as a final note, to say that this is perhaps, in my estimation, in some ways, the most interesting provincial archivist, Schofield, E.O.S. Schofield, who was a provincial archivist from 1910 to 1919, and he made collecting trips into the Caribou. Here you see him with a gunny sack over his shoulder, and he would collect materials relating to the history of early British Columbia and the Caribou in particular. And he took, before the days of tapes, he took interviews and wrote down what people said in his notebooks. And so he was alive to oral history, which is now a special division within the archives, and taped interviews and other taped materials and sound archives generally are being preserved in that division now.
There are 4 floors of records in this provincial archives, row upon row of documents, millions and millions of written words about the history of BC. And up until about now, most of the history recorded as the written word. And one of the oldest documents, a ship's log, the Halcyon, which made a voyage from Bengal to the coast of Northwest America as far back as 1792. And it was Captain C.W. Barclay who piloted that vessel and took his place in BC history. 100 years later, professional photography had hit the West, as displayed in Carlton Watkins' pictorial journey through Northern California and Oregon. The Watkins album, according to the experts at the archives, is valued at $100,000 today. And of course, a great number of the records today, whether it's from the sheriff's office, government records, periodicals, newspapers, or from an electoral district on past elections, are being recorded on microfilm. Which brings us to the future. The people at the archives have got perhaps a monumental task ahead of them. The degree of selection will be much more detailed, because in the future, a good deal, the bulk of the history in BC will be recorded on videotape, a very expensive process.
We're also going to become, I wouldn't be surprised, sort of museums of technology, because you have to have a machine that will enable a researcher to examine the videotape, listen to the sound, play back a magnetic tape if it's factual information that is put into a computer.
Which brings us to dollars and cents. It's going to be a very costly matter.
It's going to be much more costly. These records, if it's costly to create, it seems it's costly to preserve. That if you, write a letter longhand, it isn't very hard to just sort of place it on a shelf and it'll remain there. You can carry it to a reference room. Maintenance costs are low, servicing costs are low. If you have a videotape on that shelf, you need a machine in your research room that can be used by the public. That machine has to be maintained. It's costly to buy. The film itself has to be rewound, looked after. In some cases, videotape seems to be very short-lived from the archival point of view, and videotape needs to be transferred onto film of archival quality that can be counted on to last,
hundreds of years.
We hope so, given proper conditions.